Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Big Questions in Kraków. There will be plenty asked. I hope that many of them will also be answered. Today we are going to discuss the nature of language. Let's see whether we will be able to find some things in common. I hope that we will go beyond just the very definition. And with me today I start from our overseas guest, Professor Vincent Janik, who is the director of the Scotch Oceans Institute at the University of St Andrews. And on my right side, we have Professor Wiesław Lubaszewski, who is head of the Department of Computer Linguistics at the Jagiellonian University and Professor of Computer Science at University of Science and Technology in Kraków. It's probably very unscientific to try to discuss language in a language, which more or less for none of the three of us is the native language. Because even in simplest systems, you can easily prove, for example, in electric circuits, that if your sensor or meter is a part of the system, it distorts all the readings that you finally get. Nonetheless, I believe that we shall give it a try, or maybe a few tries. And to make the matters even more interesting, we will go beyond the human dimension of language to machines and to animals. So, gentlemen, before we start talking about your specific fields, do we have one definition of language that we can agree to? What is language to you?
Well, I think if I start, we often get the question whether animals have language, and particularly dolphins that I work on. To me, the reply to that is always that language is part of the human communication system. And I'm very aware that a lot of definitions are so specific to humans that we won't be able to test whether they apply to animals. It's a little bit of a cheap way out, though, because we're just kind of saying that's human, and then therefore we pass on to animal communication systems. But one of the things that are interesting, of course, is to look at components of language. And so the main thing that I'm interested in is just breaking it down and look at what are interesting cognitive components of language and see whether we can see equivalents in animals.
And the machines?
Machines are using very old traditional approach. Language is an abstract system of symbols to communicate.
Articulated?
Yes. So you can have formal definition, like, for example, introduced by Chomsky, but you have grammar and a dictionary. So it's much easier to operate such a definition in machine applications.
Grammar as in set of rules, and
yes,
vocabulary as linguistic items that you fill the rules.
Symbols. Each symbol has form, meaning, reference, and is realized in a phonic substance or graphic substance. That's classic definition, and I think there's no reason to contest such a definition.
Unless you're an animal, because I don't think that animals would have graphic representation of any speech sounds. So as long as we're in machines and humans, yes, actually, I looked up definitions of language. In 5 minutes, using Google, I found 46. And Britannica says that language is a system of conventional spoken, manual, or written symbols by means of which human beings, as members of social groups and participants in its culture, express themselves. Oxford says the method of human communication. So, do animals have language?
Yeah, that's a question that we're often asked, and I think like I said before, would always talk about animal communication and that we can communicate with animals. If we talk about language, it's a little harder, but of course I can just reduce it to that. If people ask me, can we eventually talk to dolphins? I can say we're doing that already. We're analyzing what their sounds, in what context their sounds occur, We then develop hypotheses and make predictions on how an animal should react if it hears a sound. And then in our test, in our main test that we're using, is a playback experiment in which we, in a very specific situation, play a treatment and a control sound. And we have a very specific expectation from our observations what the difference in the response should be if our assumptions about the actual information content of the signal is correct. But in that situation, I produce a sound. The animal will often react back with a sound. If you want to, you can call that a dialogue and an exchange. And if I just kind of talk about communication, yes, I communicate. Yet people also communicate with their dogs in a similar way. Dogs do learn to understand certain vocal or also hand signals, and vice versa. But that's often not what people mean. What they really mean is, do these animals just speak another version of French? And if I learn it, can I talk to them? And I think the key question here is really one: what lies behind those signals? And the key words that are coming up with that are intentions, or intentionality, in fact, and meaning. And if I think about meaning, depending again on who you ask, there are schools that very vehemently say if there's no intention, and not just no intention, but no intention to communicate, then therefore there can't be any meaning. Grice made that distinction between natural and non-natural meaning. And we have, terminology is always difficult when you go across fields, but in biology we use the distinction between cue and signal. The natural meaning is really something that is very close to what we call a cue, which means, I can tell, for example, from dark clouds in the sky that it's probably going to rain. There's a close association between the two, so I'm using those as a cue. The clouds are not trying to communicate to me that it's going to rain. I'm using that as a cue, and the difference would really be me telling you it's going to rain. Where not only do I have the intention to inform you about this, but also you recognize my intention. And so this kind of interaction between two minds is something that, at least to Grice, lies at the very heart of meaning. And going across different fields, those terms are used in very different ways. And amongst biologists, meaning is often just used as another word for information content, which is something very different, because that doesn't require an intention to communicate. So I think the kind of question of do animals have language really kind of currently goes back to the questions: do animals intend to inform? Do they intend to communicate? And is that intention recognized by the receiver? And those are very difficult questions to answer.
Certainly, but you've mentioned meaning a number of times, and Professor, you mentioned grammar, and you meant certain lexical items, certain elements of information.
Symbols.
What about symbols? What about meaning? What about the semantic level of those?
Oh, you can observe meaning in speech or in text. You can observe some relations between word or symbol you think you want to define. For example, if you have home, okay, it's a good word. You look for meaning definition in text corpora, for example. You can look for different verbs or even specific verb, which is idiosyncratic to home. Yeah, and you can find sell, build, many verb, but especially one is important because it's dwell, for example, or live in. So we are looking for calculus, which allow to predict which associated verb is specific or idiosyncratic. It's not easy. It's not easy because all these experiments are still
experiments.
Yes, in a preliminary stage, because if you have human association test.
Can you please explain what human association
yes,
test
it's
is?
a word called stimulus, and you can ask participant, bring first word which you associate when you comprehend stimulus. And if you look at results, you will see that people will bring only one verb to dwell. You can't find a difference between languages. For example, there was a very fine Edinburgh Associative Thesaurus. Now they shut the website which presented, because I think we decided that it's too old. No, it's not too old, because test is more than 100 years old. The American psychiatrist started to use it to develop association norms, to test some mental instability. And results are repeatable. In Polish, you will get in present day experiment, you will get verb mieszkać.
Mieszkać?
Yes. And it's no difference between this Scottish experiment from 70 years ago, and it's not different from this American experiment 100 years ago. So there is some stable connections which does not depend on language. I mean, this group of languages spoken in Europe and called Indo-European languages. But there is no difference. There is large stability. If you look at the 16th century Polish dictionary, for example, great Polish poet Kochanowski has got a dictionary now. And if you look meaning of word home, it looks the same like today. It's such kind of interesting phenomenon, because we can understand language spoken even 1,000 years ago. Yes.
Well, isn't it too far-fetched, like all the daj ać pobruszę, a ty počivaj being quite hard to understand, or the rozmowa mistrza Polikarpa ze śmiercią, which
right.
has to be simplified for students to be understandable?
Yes. Meaning of the symbols, the grammar has changed in the history. Meaning of the basic symbols related to basic human activities are stable.
So we have the same deep structure, and superficially the words, the symbols are changing, but they still denote the same. And the relations are the same?
Deep structure you can find in sentence or in text. In dictionary you have basic definition of meaning. And of course during history you can find some word being more polysemic than earlier, but this basic meaning still retained. Yes, it does not change. It's really it's not astonishing.
It's constant, so we should be used to it.
Yes.
And how about the animal communication? Is this communication, or how we understand it, also at a preliminary stage? Is there still more to be done, more to be researched than has already been learned?
Absolutely. I think scientists tend to start at the most obvious, and of course that's most easily observed, but also gives us an opportunity to perhaps understand a very basic component of systems. And that normally means that we are logging on to very specific contexts that are very significant for the animals. That could be food, that could be predators and alarm, it could be in the context of attracting mates. Those are kind of key components of their lives that are important, and those are often situations where very obvious signals are being given, and so therefore they're also obvious to us. However, I think there is now a kind of recognition that there is a whole another layer of communication that animals have, often in something that is perhaps a lot less conventional, a lot less has a lot less rules perhaps than these situations, and that is sometimes just two animals sitting close together, often at very low amplitude, exchanging sounds. And scientists will call these chatter or use terms like that, which is kind of akin to how humans have a chat in a way. And we know very little about those kinds of signals. However, having said that, it's interesting and always risky for us to kind of use this anthropomorphic explanation. So using the term chatter, for example, already implies a whole range of things to people. And just to give you one example where that's counterintuitive to us. So two individuals sitting close together, talking perhaps not very loudly to each other. If you look at birds and birds encountering each other in territorial contests, what you often have is very loud singing, counter-singing that is not only directed at each other, but also at the same time, because of it being loud, can be perceived by animals in adjacent territories that are quite far away. So these animals can eavesdrop on this interaction that's going on. However, if you look at those interactions in the European robin, for example, they go through stages of escalation in their interaction, and at the start it's very loud. They have this counter-singing, but then before they actually attack each other, there's a phase of very quiet sounds that look very much like chatter. And it kind of seems that at that stage, you can ask, are they now suddenly friendly? Of course they're not. This is a stage of escalation. It lies between yelling at each other and attacking each other. So it's just
gathering the strengths, or?
No, I think what it is really that this kind of eavesdropping is something that is, in general, in animal communication, quite a big component, and also a component that influences what a sender, an animal calling, does. So if I speak very loudly or I sing very loudly, there are consequences, because I'm giving information not just to my direct opponent, but also to everyone else around. While
possibly a predator?
Well, predator is yes, that's an additional layer of complexity if you want to. Right now I'm just sticking with one species.
Sure, sorry.
So if you have other males around that defend territories, for example, they can eavesdrop on these interactions, and by how these interactions work, they can work out who's stronger and who's weaker. In the future, in a variety of animals where this has been tested, an animal that has been eavesdropping on such an interaction will then use that information that it extracted in the next interaction. So an animal that listened to a contest like this and is then faced with one or the other, depending on whether they're faced with the winner of this interaction or the loser, they react differently. And this is without them seeing an actual interaction where one chases the other away. They're just listening to the interaction. So this kind of quiet interaction that they have before full escalation is probably a moment where they just really want to communicate with the other one. So, I'm giving you my last warning, but at the same time, it is perhaps something that I don't want everyone else to hear, because once I've lost this interaction, I want to go to the next, maybe challenge someone else for their territory. I don't want to give this animal all the information already from my previous experience. But at the surface, to us, looking at this from a human point of view, this looks like a friendly interaction. Right? If I just cut out this quiet bit, you kind of go, well, they're chattering away. So I think we have to be careful with those interpretations. But nevertheless, those are very interesting interactions that are harder to study, because the animals are quiet, they're often close together, and it's much more difficult to even just get at the signal, because without disturbing the animals. And so those kinds of interactions, coming back to your original question, haven't been studied very well. And it's true for a lot of animals that there are large parts of their repertoire that we haven't really looked at. And in dolphins, the animals I work at, we are focusing on sounds that travel quite far. They're producing click sequences that are very high frequency, that are used for echolocation, but also for communication, and very little is known about those sequences. Yet that makes up probably for whistling dolphin, at least half of its repertoire.
Thank you. So in the best way, we know about a half, but definitely not everything even about that half.
Absolutely.
And in case of machine language, in case of that, I understand that this is an absolutely anthropomorphic environment, because these are machines that we create with our minds, and then...
Yes, but machines are deterministic machines. So it's very
But
important. Yes?
something determines them, and I believe that, like,
No.
that they must be created to the image, so probably to the image of our mind and our way of seeing
Yes,
the world.
but they are all the same. No, okay? Since Turing machine, all machines are logically are the same. We may have different physical properties of computers, computer systems, but this general idea is unchanged. So we can present some input data and some rules to convert this input data into output data. That's all. This output data can be readable for next machine, and then you have sequence of machines which cooperate, and it's transfer of output data to the input and so on. That's all. So if you have such machine and you think how to present natural language expression to make this machine to operate, you may think how to present a language understanding. And in this moment, we know we have symbols. Symbols have meaning, reference, and the form. We can build sequences of symbols to express some intent. That's all. And there's a good example of such question answering systems. It's the very old branch of Computational Linguistics. Now we have some good example of such system built by IBM. It's a Watson, and the system, this question answering system, which win Jeopardy. It's a television game. Yes.
A game very well known to
yes.
British.
Yes, American. Yes. And after some years of training, collecting knowledge, because system
needs to have a full
knowledge,
database.
Yes, system defeated human master. Oh yeah, it's great, but
But the information was input by another machine or by humans?
By humans.
By humans.
By humans.
So multiple humans defeated an individual human using a machine that made their task
created
difficult.
Algorithms smart enough to defeat a human being. Smart enough and fast enough. Because time is very important in this game. And how Watson is understanding, because this may be interesting. We can't say how human being understands really. We have some hypotheses, but we don't know for sure. Going back to this formal definition of abstract machine, we can say we have, for example, some intents. For example, where is? Then, in this intent, symbolic intent, can be not understandable, but can be operational to the algorithm. Now we have to connect to this intent some sentences. How can I get to the station, for example? And the intent is whereas. It's a simple, understandable for human. It's a question about location of some object, okay? Where is, how can I get, and all possible variants of this question in natural language. It's simply simple pattern recognition. It's not real understanding, but it works.
And it's fast.
And it's fast.
200 million operations in chess
Yes,
computers,
and it's
for
fast.
example.
But
A second.
Yes, but in this, but in fact, we are still working on pattern recognition and some simple reasoning. Is it even it is statistic reasoning or logical reasoning, which is based on semantic relations? It's still quite simple. If you, let me give you an example. I'm thinking how to say in English. Okay. Survivor suddenly regained his composure, okay? Yes? He heard barking, distant barking, okay? Is it understandable? Okay. Human being can explain why this pure human being suddenly understood he will survive because of this barking, okay? Simple reasoning, barking, dog barks, where is the dog? There must be human being, and so on. It's not easy to collect data and present all situations to perform such a reasoning. Of course, we can explain the result of reasoning. We can't say how we really can find this solution. Okay? And it's a real problem. So Watson is magnificent. It's very bright system, but it can't really understand.
Like we do, because it has some form of its own understanding.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But all computer systems works on the same way. Simply operate on symbols. We are defining meaning of these symbols. And you can't expect that suddenly computer will find something new. But it can find new pattern similar to patterns it knows already. That's all. But it can be very useful. And of course, people are, journalists are writing about artificial intelligence. It's our future, and can we be afraid of this intelligence? It's not an intelligence. Because intelligence, even human, can produce language. I do believe that's true. That animals have a simple form of language, maybe limited to circumstances. They don't write poems and so on, but they communicate. It's I think it's beyond doubt.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely communication.
Yes.
And intelligence, which is required
Yes.
for that communication.
Yeah, underlying cognitive processes, I would say. I always shy away from the term intelligence a little bit, partly because
Could
it
you
has
elaborate?
because it has a lot of baggage in psychology in terms of how it was used, and so
IQ and all that.
exactly. So there, and also similarities to what you've done earlier, where you asked us to define language. If you ask people to define intelligence, you probably come up with similar variety of definitions. And I think in animal cognition now, it's very popular to think about intelligence as a modular aspect, or the brain as a modular construct in which you have certain, I don't even want to say areas, because they're not necessarily areas, but networks perhaps, that are responsible for certain skills. And then if you can identify those, then you can look at, well, two perhaps very different of different modules like that, what happens when you put them together. And there's certainly great popularity in the idea that those kinds of combinations of complex systems lead to emerging properties which are perhaps not predictable at the start, and perhaps also not specifically selected for at the start, which is an interesting thought, because when we're thinking about things biologically and from an evolutionary perspective, we're thinking about selection, and we're thinking about, well, if there is some new feature, for it to survive and to be passed on to further generations, it needs to be, the individual must survive, and so therefore this feature must somehow improve this individual's reproductive success, or inclusive fitness, as we say. But for something like this, if I had two independent systems that work side by side in the brain, solving two different questions that perhaps have been selected for, they may yet lead to emerging properties, to emerging skills that actually have no selective advantage, but they just come out of it. And best example, candidate for that perhaps that people use is consciousness, where people ask, is consciousness actually adaptive, or is this something that's an emerging property out of these complex systems interacting? Which of course is an interesting question, and I think when you kind of say categorically, it's not an intelligence, if that is the case, that these systems can interact, could there ever, and that is, I guess, the fear for people, I'm by no means any expert in this, that there are emerging properties that we can't predict.
Yes, maybe, but there is a next step, because they can say about finding, to name the founding. Yes, because if you have, for example, something new, you can say it's lion with some special feature, something like lion, but
Pink nose, let's say.
Okay, but it's and we don't know, is it lion or not? If we find determine is it a new species of lion, so we can communicate this.
Well, initially today we had a box here, or a cube, and we were wondering whether it is a table.
Yes.
So whether it is enough to be a table for a cube. Sorry, whether it is enough for something like that to be a table. I wanted to put my notes on it, so it was a table to me, but
yes,
your questions,
can you
table-lity or table-ness.
Yes.
So when something goes to a different category, because a part of it is different or the use of it is different, will that be something to get a machine lost?
Yes. Yes.
And then it has to be taught extra data.
When we observe such human being which does not speak yet, it may observe reality, small restricted reality, is mother, grandma, dog, maybe cat, that's all. And none of this woman has no linguistic training at all. But they can teach the baby to speak. First is reference. This is dog, dog. Okay. And then somehow this baby can recognize the dog outside his environment, and I think it's something mysterious in this process, and we can't simulate this process in the computer because we don't know really how to formalize.
But isn't it just reaction to cues, and the only problem being definition of the cues, like in animals that there are some animals, some monkeys, I believe, that inform you with a specific shriek that it's a danger coming from the ground, like a lion or leopard, and a different one when it's an eagle.
Yes. Yes, so you have those in animals, and those are the best examples, I think, for what's being called referential communication, and at least the study of animal communication. And this referential communication, really, there was a distinction made, which I think is odd from a philosophical point of view, but for a biologist makes more sense, is that a question of referring to something external to the individual making the sound. And that division between external and internal was one that was introduced mostly for kind of reasons of accessibility for a question. Because if I, for example, we of course have reference that informs about ourselves. So I can say I am in pain, or I can go ouch. And the ouch is seen as a more involuntary utterance that is a reaction perhaps to a pain stimulus. While if I say I am in pain, I'm again back to this idea of I have an intention to communicate with you and inform you. You recognize that I'm trying to communicate with you. And so if I now want to study this kind of reference in animals, it's very difficult to make that distinction. I can tell you, in humans it's clear I'm using language or I'm saying ouch, which is kind of a different non-verbal, often called non-verbal or communication. So it's easier for us as scientists to kind of go, okay, if I take something that's outside of the animal, then it's easier for me to distinguish between just an expression of pain, for example, or fear, over real information about what happens outside of the animal. So this division has kind of been introduced for that purpose, really. That's not to say that reference would not be impossible about internal states as well, but it's really about accessibility. And so the example you just gave, the first one, or best described, is probably in vervet monkeys, but there's a variety of other species that produce calls that clearly give information about the type of predator. So in the vervet monkey, it's ground predator, usually the distinction is always between leopard, eagle, and snake. And depending on what call is heard, the receiver will display a different type of behavior, the appropriate behavior to avoid this type of predator. And there has been a lot of research trying to decipher whether this is really just a graded distinction, for example, where I'm still just expressing my fear, and perhaps I'm more afraid of a leopard than of an eagle, and so that's why they're different. But they're very good experiments showing that that's not the case. And so clearly there is information in those calls. Now, the interesting difference to human communication in that particular example is that all these vervet monkeys have these calls from birth. No one is teaching them those calls. What they do learn is what the calls mean, or what the association is. So what you do find, though, in a young vervet monkey, for example, is that there is a predisposition for the different kinds of predator. So a young vervet monkey will give an eagle alarm call to a falling leaf, but it won't give a leopard alarm call to a falling leaf. So there's some predisposition that this particular call refers to something above me. And then over time, they learn the very specific stimulus that this is relevant to. So they will then at some stage give the signal to all birds they see. At the next stage, they give it to all birds of prey, and then only at the final stage will they really only give it to those kinds of birds of prey that are a danger. And so there is learning involved. There is clearly modification through the environment, but the actual form of the signal itself is there from the start. And that appears to be the case for most cases where we know about this kind of referential relationship between the signal and the referent.
Narrowing down the database, you could say. In the beginning there were leaves and birds and everything, then only birds of prey, and then only birds of prey big enough to eat me. Now a computer won't feel pain and won't tell a difference between what happens to it, and it certainly has nothing imprinted in it like those possibilities, potentials.
Right. Marvin Minsky, the break of centuries. It's great.
No, 20th, 21st, yes?
Yes, yes, of course. Marvin Minsky is a great researcher on artificial intelligence. Started to learning about emotions, robots' emotions. So how to represent or to introduce the emotions, human-like emotions to robots. Yes, but it's an idea, but we have, I think, still problem with understanding
our own emotions.
Yes, and how we react.
So it must be very fuzzy logic.
Yes. But it's not. If emotion determines your reaction. So this may be interesting too for robot. If you are working on autonomous car, which is disaster really at present stage, because these experimenters experimenting on roads, and we had some deaths because of some inadequacies. This human supervisor sometimes failed. For example, in Arizona, car didn't start to brake when some elderly women came across the street. So it's really dangerous. For example, some famous CEO of famous car manufacturer said, "Our car will always have a driving wheel." But sometimes researchers are irresponsible, because testing autonomous car on real in real traffic, I think it's still it's dangerous, because you can't predict. If you have on other side you have human driver, you can't predict what he can do suddenly.
Yeah. After one of the first crashes of those autonomous or semi-autonomous cars, one of American newspapers or magazines, no, I think it was a magazine, put up a huge headline: "Golem on our road."
Yes, but
the question is there something like intention in a computer? Can a computer have an intention?
You can try to model an intention, but you have quite simple. I think Turing was a genius, because he found this simplicity. You have input and reaction to an input and output, and you are defining everything. Machine does not define by itself.
So it only does what you tell it to do.
Yes, and there is a reason why computers are so useful. You can imagine such a thinking computer which takes care on your bank account. I think
No.
Your account is safe because computers are working as we told them.
As intended.
Yes. Yes.
So the intention perhaps lies with the person building the computer. Yeah.
Yes. Intention and formalized. Yeah. So
I'm just afraid that this computer is going to cheat me, just like when I was a child, there were all those fairy tales where some animals, usually foxes, would be the cheaters.
Mm-hmm.
The question is about communication. Do we get a lot of miscommunication? Do we people get cheated by animals, or do some animals get cheated by animals? Do we get cheated by the computers, or do we program them to cheat? Where is it? Is there some possibility? Because yes, they can outdo us. Professor Matsuzawa proved that apes can outdo us in memorizing numbers of letters, or what were they, digits? Digits. And we are outdone by the millions of operations per second by computers. But is there possibility of talking about cheating, or is it? You spoke of the survival or the will to survive.
Yeah, I think it's, again, we're coming back to definitions to a certain extent. One of the big discussions in animal communication is ongoing, I think, is the question of whether animal signals contain information or not. And the or not part of this, the other school, really argues that what animals are trying to do is they're trying to manipulate their environment to their own advantage. And this manipulation can take many different forms. It can take a fairly standardized form. If I find a way of manipulating the environment that works, I will use it again. It can also increase or introduce great variety. And so to give you an example, the idea would be if I try to manipulate without using language, but I want you to back away from me, I can make intentional movements, sudden movements, produce very loud sounds. It might not matter what kind of sound, just because it's loud. And if I do this repeatedly, you will find it unpleasant and you move away. So therefore, I've succeeded in you moving away. Alternatively, I could say, could you please move your chair further away from me? The second example where we're using language, there, we can clearly kind of track back what the individual components mean and what the information is. For the first part, the next time I want you to move away, I may make a completely different sound. I still make it a loud sound, but maybe I find another technique. And so if we think about this manipulation aspect, I think there is something to both sides of this. The example I gave earlier about eavesdropping really suggests that there is information that can be extracted by animals that are listening, but perhaps are not even perceived by the animal making the sound. So that suggests that there isn't just manipulating the immediate environment, but there's also a kind of additional layer. However, if you think about the starting point of communication, that kind of idea of manipulating the world is very appealing because, of course, what I am trying to do is I'm trying to somehow improve, again, my inclusive fitness to give the skills I have on to my offspring. And so an effective manipulation can take any kind of form. It doesn't have to be language. As long as it works, it works. Now, having said that, what's important here, and why I'm bringing this up, is when you have evolution act on these kinds of patterns, you may have a pattern establish itself that looks like cheating, but actually, again, we're coming back to the non-intentional aspect. You're right, the cuckoo is a good example of something that's where you have a strong genetic component. But even amongst animals, you have situations where in vervet monkeys, there are kind of anecdotal references more so, but situations where animals are feeding and there's a small animal sitting on the side suddenly giving an alarm call with no predator around, with everyone taking cover, and then the one animal that just gave the call will go in and take the food. And you have that in birds as well. It's not something specific to primates. And of course, at the surface, again, for me looking at it as a human, this guy's been lying. But really, for the individual, if you don't have a concept of lying or that kind of ethical code, say, for example, then all it is what you did is you manipulated your environment successfully, and it might not work the next time because these other receivers are not, they're making associations as well, and they kind of recognize you as the one that is unreliable. But nevertheless, you have, so technically, what sometimes is being used in papers is that we're calling it effectively functional deceit. So it's functionally deceitful because that means that the end result is a deceit. And in that situation, I define that not as something that bears intention. So we're coming back to that question of, did this primate actually know what it was doing? Did it mean to give false information? Or was it just a kind of, I made an association that if I give these calls without any leopards around, I can get to the food. And so we're coming back to the question, what happens inside the mind? And is the communication a window into what happens inside the mind?
And what about machines? Can machines deceive us only because they were programmed to?
Only.
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 So there must be somebody with.
Otherwise, you have blue screen. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was very frequent. If you have more and more complex operating system with intention to compete with other companies, you can make errors. Yes, so it's commercial reason, but it's the only form of cheating because you can lose your data.
And the other problem I think that's difficult with cheating is even in humans, whether it's intentional. So the example earlier, maybe that vervet thought there was a leopard. Maybe it has seen some movement in the bush that it thought it was a leopard. And so that's the other thing where at the surface something might look deceitful because I'm analyzing the situation from a different perspective, but actually from the perspective of the system, let's say, no matter whether animal or computer, giving a signal makes perfect sense given the information it has. So then there's the question of when is it an error and when is it actually, again, intentional?
This is probably why in the fairy tale, Cry Wolf, the boy or the piglet, depends which version you've read, cries wolf 3 times, and only the 4th time the wolf comes and nobody believes it or him. So that's probably there. That's some kind of conditioning. Do computers get conditioned when they learn? Those, like the IBM you mentioned, when something repeats, it takes it as a pattern.
Yes.
And when a pattern repeats, it becomes a stronger pattern, I believe.
Yes, with heavier weight. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all. And then you can think how to find. You have this training data, okay, training corpus, and then you can look for similar patterns, for similarity. Pattern consists of features, and you can find outside this training data new patterns, maybe new patterns, but they are found in another set of data. If you look for another pattern in language, for example, you have some basic training corpus with all known patterns, and then you define that this pattern is verb, object, infinitive. We know it from school. And this is a pattern for example, for machine learning.
And for processing natural language.
Yes, and you can look if there is something modified or with some addition, which is not in this initial set of patterns. But verb, object, and infinitive is very good, great pattern, even for today.
Yeah. Well, that's how our brains work. There are
Yes.
some languages that also need to know whether it's human or not. Like in Japanese, you need to suggest whether it's the human verb or inhuman.
And I think we really have patterns in using language, because we can learn text with errors and properly understand it. And even sometimes we can see errors. And there was some interesting idea made in the 70s by Roger Schenck and his co-workers, how to build such predictive parser, text parser, which used such patterns. These patterns were much more complicated than verb, object, and infinitive, because script, because I referred to this theory, it was description of basic element of reality.
And speaking of parsing, speaking of trying to process certain sequences, certain continuities, I try to find, but I haven't. Is there any research done on multiple ways? Because yes, we got used to it, that it's our voice, we developed it through millions of years as human beings, that it's probably, especially in case of animals that live in close proximity, that is, let's say, voice plus chemistry plus smell, hormones, or it's voice plus, well, the very proximity. Some animals, when they're close to each other, they even create static electricity. So have any studies of that type been done? Or for example, I know that in case of whales, they tried different frequencies of cutting out certain frequencies from the sound spectrum to see whether probably those melodies mean something, but on a different layer of spectrum than what we hear.
Yeah, so the term to look up, and if you want to search it, is multimodal.
Yes, multimodal
right?
communication between all the four.
Yeah. So and that there has been studies on this, and yes, of course, there are multimodal signals, combinations of signals from different modalities. And then on top of that, as you just mentioned at the end, where you just talked about the acoustic modality, you can focus in on certain aspects of that, on certain spectra. So there are these kinds of interactions, and of course, again, for the scientists, it makes it harder, because if I have to look at every information content that comes across, be that visual or olfactory and acoustic, can make a display incredibly complex.
Well,
now,
just like the computer has a very complex field to learn when it tries to understand us.
Yes, yeah. I think one of the appeals for me to work on marine mammals is that, in fact, in their life, the other modalities have no strong component, and the reason for that is that visibility is usually very low. This is not the impression we get when we watch TV, because no TV production in their right minds would do a dolphin project in the North Sea where you can see about this far. So of course the reason why we all think that they live in crystal clear water is because these programs are made for people and we want to see what the animals are doing. But the average environment for these animals has no good visibility. This is because of, nutrient-rich water has a lot of particles in it that doesn't allow you to see far. All the animals go at great depth, which means there's no light. So the other thing that they have is they don't have smell, because they are breath hold divers. So they will kind of take one breath and then they dive down. There actually now is some evidence that they can take, that there is, especially in the large baleen whales, that they can find food, perhaps by, or they react differently at least if there are certain chemical components in the air. But it's kind of a great advantage for me as a scientist to say, okay, all the dolphin hears is all that I'm looking at. Because if I put my underwater microphone in the water and I can record a dolphin and they're not right next to each other, I know that this dolphin over there, all it can do is can listen to the sound. There isn't additional information come across that I'm missing because I'm not looking at it. So while these animals are difficult to study, they actually have an advantage in that sense that I know all the information that comes across is what I can also observe. And of course, we're using broadband recording systems that do capture frequencies that we as humans can't hear, but we can still analyze. So yes, multimodal communication, I think, is fairly common in animals in general, but the ones that I work with, it's less of an issue.
Yes. My first lecture each year starts in computer science. We will deal with problems well known to Aristotle. But we have
a new toy.
Yes, a new toy, a new problem. How to present this knowledge to this abstract machine. But really, we don't know much more about language than Aristotle, in fact.
So this is your first lecture, and what do you follow on to?
The last lecture.
Right. And what's in between? What is the content of the courses you teach? What's the essence?
What's the essence? We have to learn more. There is the sequence of open questions.
We have to learn more. Is that also the conclusion?
Isn't that the conclusion
your
for all
case?
science? That we all,
Yes.
every finding will open up new questions.
Yes.
I think that's the,
Yeah.
but that's sort of the fun of it, isn't it?
It is, and I believe that we have to learn more, so we invite you to another meeting of the big questions in Kraków. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.